The first speaker on this session is Sheila Jeffries, Why Equality Doesn't Work.
What I'm going to do today is talk about the concept of equality. And what I'm going to do, I think, is going to be rather tame compared with the extraordinary, wonderful, feisty, revolutionary discussions that have been happening in all the rooms that I've been in. So I hope this will not disappoint. But basically, I'm not going to talk about the transvestite rights movement at all. I'm going to talk about more generally what we need to do that, for the next stage, because all these wonderful, wonderful women have been brought back or have been brought in to the feminist struggle because of the extraordinary behavior of these men. But there are other things that we need to think about. So I've been a little bit concerned in the general discussions that we've been having that women have been using, and I do myself, often the kind of shorthand, use terms like equality and equal and so on and so on. So I'm not sort of pure here. I have used these terms and often I do, but I am very concerned by the fact that we use this language. And I want to talk about today why this language is a problem. The terms women's equality is very much used by feminists to represent our aims. But such terms give a false and misleading idea of what women's oppression is about and how we should go about ending it. And of course, this whole conference is about what is to be done. The expression women's equality suggests that the current way that societies are organized is positive or somehow natural. The idea of equality is that the oppressed need to be able to fit into this society. And it is then the fault of those who do not fit in, who do not thrive, if they cannot. It is their own fault because it's the best of all possible worlds that they're trying to get into and don't. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say that any fundamental change in the way that that society is organized is necessary. People just need to be able to get into it. Right? It's a politics of accommodation to the supposedly best of all possible worlds that already exist. Now, it can give the term equality the impression that oppressed people just need greater opportunities to express their ambitions and integrate into a society that is not fundamentally problematic. This is nobody's fault, this approach suggests. The responsibility of this positive society is to give people who need it a leg up so that they can realize their potential. There should be training and legislation against discrimination. There should be social services to keep people from destitution whilst they're trying to get their leg up. The society itself is just perfect as it is, so long as it extends a helping hand to those who are just not very competent. It's mostly women who are just not very competent. In fact, of course, race, sex, and class are structural oppressions. This means that the society that people who are oppressed in these ways are adjured to make their best efforts to succeed in is stacked against them from the ground up. And societies are arranged in these ways because someone benefits: the rich in the system of capitalism and men in male domination. It is not an accident. These structural oppressions were created and are maintained because they benefit capitalists and men. The argument that the poor, the racially oppressed, women, have the responsibility to strive for their own betterment if they want to succeed in life is, in the end, a way to blame the victim for their own oppression. Back in 1972, the American writer William Ryan explained that the idea of equality of opportunities was a way in which the oppressive system of racist capitalism passed on the responsibility for inequality to the poor. What it did, he said, had the effect of, as the title of his book expresses it, it's called blaming the victim. In a stacked system, poor people and Black people in the US were expected to strive for success as an individual responsibility. But the system, the education system, the justice system, were organized against them, and the disadvantages of birth ensured perpetual inequality. To those who had was given, and to those who had not, much was taken away. It was cruel to stack the system and then blame those whose ability to navigate it was full of obstacles from the moment of their birth. There was nothing equal about that. So, if the suffering of women is a matter of historical accident, as the idea of equality would suggest, then what is to be done is clear. We must carry on trying to make women equal to men. The language of equality is generally used in relation to the workplace to cover equal pay and access to occupations. Much of the framework has already been constructed to suit this aim. The creation of the infrastructure began in the UK in 1970 with the Equal Pay Act, which proclaimed that men and women should be paid the same for like work. We are probably, most of us, pretty well aware of how this turned out. Now, the current incarnation of this legislation is the Equality Act of 2010. There are masses of regulations, training schemes, and quotas aimed at increasing the percentage of women in the workforce, on company boards, in Parliament. All of this has been effective in enabling women to enter and succeed in many areas of work that they were almost entirely absent from when the women's liberation movement began in the UK in 1970. So I am not saying that we should abandon this approach, and indeed, I was involved in my Equal Opportunities Committee in my university for many, many, many years. The Equal Opportunities policy at that university is, of course, now called Diversity and Inclusion. I looked it up the other day. So we have lost anything that suggests there might be anything real about the disadvantages going on or any kind of politics. I saw it all happening and I knew that that's what it would say. Now, it's an interesting question, however, as to whether equal numbers of persons from two different status categories will lead to equality. Supposing you have equal numbers of men and women somewhere, for instance. As one feminist academic, Amy Ellman, once explained to me, and I think this was back in the 1980s, traditional marriage has equal numbers, one man and one woman. But rape, violence, and exploitation persist. He was talking about the situation in Sweden in the 90s, at a time where equal numbers, one man and one woman, did not inhibit men from beating up their female partners and still does not. What matters, of course, is not just numbers, but the structure behind those numbers, which provides and maintains the hierarchy that gives them meaning. Not surprisingly, the progress that has resulted from the approach of the equality approach towards ending the oppression of women has been very slow and in many respects non-existent, or is even going backwards. Some simple statistics may help us see how little progress there has been. Is this okay? I'm not going too fast and everybody can hear me, yes? Absolutely fine. Good-o. Now, the construction trades are a very good example of an area in which there has been no progress towards equality in numbers in 50 years. The percentage of workers in the construction trades, the percentage of women workers in the construction trades in Australia is estimated to be 3%. Actually, that's slightly different. I think a few years ago it was 2%. So that's pretty good. And in the UK, it is estimated to be 4.4%. Apparently, that's a huge increase over previous figures, but of course it starts from a rather low base. Now, there was a campaign to get women into manual trades called Women in Manual Trades, set up in the UK in 1975, which I remember very well. It was relaunched, interestingly, in 2021. Now, men keep these jobs to themselves because they're well paid and they are respected, skilled occupations. I think the manual trades are always a very interesting litmus test about equality. I'm not going to believe any of it until we've got at least half women in the manual trades in those decent, respected jobs. The fact that the numbers are now so appallingly low suggests that there are some areas which are important to men where there's no conceivable chance of women achieving equality by incremental change. I mean, it's just not a possibility. Another area in which the idea of women's equality with men is inconceivable at present is that of what is called the gender pay gap. The World Economic Forum in 2023 states that the world gender pay gap will take well over 100 years to close. I mean, what are we waiting for, folks? What are we waiting for? Women earned 82 cents for every dollar that men made in 2022, regardless of the job or industry type or even years of experience. Now, in the UK, the gender pay gap, 1.2%, is the equivalent of 114 days, meaning women work for free for nearly a third of the year. This is the Trades Union Council. The Trades Union Council General Secretary Paul Novak said, working women deserve equal pay, but at present rates of progress, it will take more than 20 years to close the gender pay gap. I think it's going to take a bit longer than that. Now, UK figures recently showed that women retire with a pension pot on average of 38% less than men. 38% less than men. This is because women start out with lower pay and then have to take time off to have babies and look after them, and also look after family members, parents and offspring with disabilities and so on. This huge difference is an expression of women's traditional oppression. It means that women are doomed to poverty after working jobs both inside and outside the home all their lives. It's hard to provide precisely correct figures, but because, I mean, there's all sorts of different figures out there, reached in all sorts of different ways, and I haven't looked at them all carefully to see what they left out, what their methodology was, and so on. So excuse me if you find some different figures when you're looking up some of these things, okay? Now, you can see the general picture, though. And I never was a liberal feminist, as those women who believed that women might achieve equality through a form of gradualism was called. Gradualism is a Fabian approach, I should say, for those interested in the history of the left in the UK. Anybody interested in Fabians here? Yes, indeed. But I do wonder what those women who once did believe this would work, this gradual approach, would say now, 50 years later, when the disparities are immense. So the language of equality is also used in many other places as well, in in relation to women's opportunities, such as areas such as politics, sports, the arts. The improvement of women's opportunities in the public sphere, however, is dependent on their situation in the private sphere. Now, this is quite different from men in any particular group. They do not have a situation in which they're slaves in a private sphere and subject to being murdered. I mean, that's not the case for anybody else. So it's only the case for women. So it's quite impossible for women to be equal to men, because men have the advantage of what the radical feminist theorist Catherine McKinnon calls an affirmative action program. I'm going to keep using that phrase, the affirmative action program for men, which means that women's situation is quite different. There are two foundations to this affirmative action program. One is marriage, which provides men with a slave class. Men's ownership of this slave class is the very basis of male domination, and women can never possess this. The other is that the world is created in men's image. Men constructed all the institutions and practices of male-dominant societies in ways which suited them. Women face largely insuperable obstacles to what is these days usually called inclusion. Now, women cannot achieve inclusion because they cannot exit what radical feminists call their sex class, which is why I prefer the term sex caste to the term sex class, because that makes it clear that the subordinate status of womanhood is lifelong, cradle to grave. It's not affected by riches or occupation. Now, the status of people in other subordinate groups can be changed because it is not caste status. It is possible, although very hard, for a working class person, as they call it, to make good and improve their social position. My parents did that. A woman, however, cannot leave her womanhood behind. She's still a woman, whatever her wealth, and must still fear rape from her husband and male strangers, and must take precautions. It doesn't matter if she's the queen. I often use the example of the man in the Queen's bedroom. That was 1982, I think. He broke into Buckingham Palace, was in the Queen's bedroom. She managed to press the button and get security come and to put her dressing gown on. So they tell us anyway. That is what they tell us in the press, that the Queen was not raped. But she feared that, like any woman does and always must. And she's the most protected woman probably on earth at that time. The basis of the affirmative action program is the institution of marriage. The exchange of women between men for sexual, reproductive, and labor use takes many forms historically. It always consists of the ownership of women in women's bodies and capacity to reproduce, whether it takes the form of monogamy or polygamy, marriage by capture that happens in Chechnya, where a group of young men go with their friends to a young girl's house and they kidnap her, rape her, and then she is captured. Whether it takes the form of so-called or love marriage. Nobody talks about companionate marriage anymore. In the 1960s, they did. Men and women were supposed to be each other's companions. I don't think it worked tremendously well. There's also, of course, child marriage or arranged marriage, and many, many other forms. In all these forms, women's movement and ownership of property has historically been controlled by men. And in many of these forms, women were sold or exchanged for use or benefit between men. All of men's advantages stem from this. Men are able to gain prestige, wealth, power, because they have slaves in the form of women. I use the term slave because women's work for men is unpaid. Servants are paid. So women are not servants. On the basis of this slave ownership, men designed their ideologies and institutions to fit their circumstances as slave owners, to justify, maintain, and administer male domination. The idea of equality suggests that members of this historical slave class should be able to enter these institutions on equal terms. But these institutions were created directly off women's backs, out of the existence for men of a slave class. In some parts of the world in the last century, the rigid constraints which kept women barefoot and pregnant have been lessened. But though women may now divorce in the UK, that was a really big advance. And though rape in marriage is now illegal, still goes on, but of course is now apparently illegal. The fact that men have wives and the fact that women do not have wives, men have wives, women do not have wives, provides men with an insuperable advantage. Women suffer a double disadvantage because they are both required to be men's wives, doing the labor of bringing up children and servicing a man, providing sexual access, though they may deeply resent this, and do not themselves have wives. So they have to do the work of wives, but they do not have wives themselves. So it's a double disadvantage. Women do not get serviced by the unpaid labor of a slave class. Their relationships to just about everything are completely affected thereby. This unpaid work of women for men is invaluable to men. And whilst men have wives whose services they can exploit, there can be no level playing field for women. The idea of equality cannot make sense. Women currently do an extra, this is just one study and there will be others that will tell you other things, an extra 7 hours housework a week if they have a male partner. Women without male partners do not do this 7 hours extra labor. Women considerably lessen their housework as soon as they get a man out the house, even if they have 10 children. I mean, that is the way that it is. Right? In the UK, women do 60% more housework than men. There will be other studies. Change did not happen when women went out to work. They had to do the double shift. Remember the double shift? You will remember that in the 60s, it was much written about because women started going out to work and they had to do the double shift. Though there's been a small increase in men doing housework, it's not substantial. I think, though, that the number is low. I suspect, that is for 7 hours, I suspect it may not include such matters as emotional labor, which are never counted, and sexual labor, all the unwanted sex that women have to do, which is often goes on for quite a long time. And women wish it would not. And so I think that if I was doing the research, I would put other things in there that they are not putting in there. Of course I would. Now, the way in which the basic unit of male domination, the heterosexual or male-dominated family, is organized in the West, isolates women in individual servitude, where they're not only without any support in the work of child rearing and servicing of men, but without any recourse against the violence of the men they are attached to. These couples or families live in separate homes so that a man can be serviced individually, but the woman is isolated from her peers and must labor alone. It suits capitalism to create separate consumer units, which all need their own washing machine, and it makes women powerless and easily exploited. The man can exploit the individual woman. The heterosexuality upon which these arrangements are justified is, of course, enforced socially, as is the idea of love, so that these arrangements can be kept. But in the vast majority of the world, there's no suggestion of love or anything like that. It's just an arrangement, sale, exchange, and so on. No alternative to these arrangements is publicly acknowledged. Once upon a time in the 1970s, we used to talk about all these things and talk about how architecture had to change, the absurd idea of individual houses for these labor units to be established in, it's called heterosexual couples, labor units to be established in. We used to talk about how absurd that was and how everything had to change. Has it changed? There's nothing else. There is pretty much no alternative. Now, women who leave the house to engage in paid work alongside the unpaid work they do in their homes have the responsibility, because they have no right they don't have a right to work as men do. They have to look after everything else first. They have to organize the work of the household and their work for the husband. A student of mine in Australia did an honours thesis based on interviews with the women who worked with her mother behind the scenes at the family court. She set out to refute the idea that outsourcing forms of domestic labour was a big benefit to wives, which helped them to gain equality, sort of getting others to do the labour. What she found was that organising this outsourcing was a heavy form of labour in itself. The interviewees explained that they were responsible for employing or engaging all those, mostly women, who would otherwise substitute for them in the home. These included the house cleaners, those who cleaned their husband's shirts, which the wives delivered to them and collected, gardeners, who might have been men, I guess, and the mostly women who created their ready meals and those who cared for their children. They would still have to get the children to and from school or childcare, often seen as a woman's responsibility to pay for, since it was her choice to work. To arrange all that the children needed at school, from washing the football clothes to creating costumes for dress-up days. She may also have to arrange her husband and children's social activities. The responsibilities are endless. Women who can afford it may engage a substitute wife in the form of a nanny. So outsourcing does not really help women. Who is responsible, who is the housekeeper, is the woman always. She is likely to feel that she's always failing in comparison with her male co-workers who may network at after-work drinks or engage in leisure activities. The leisure studies research shows that women do not have leisure. They pretty much don't have leisure. Men do. Leisure studies is about what men do. And one of the things they do is prostitution, of course, and another is looking at pornography and so on. Men have many leisure activities. It used to be train spotting when I was young, which I think was much healthier, but they don't seem to really do that anymore. Or stamp collecting. Hardly anyone does that. I'd like to say something about work, because some of the institutions that I want to talk about some of the institutions that are indelibly shaped by men's needs and interests. Catherine McKinnon explains that the idea of work was constructed out of a male lifestyle. So traditionally, the workman was assumed to have a wife who would fill his lunch pail before he left the house. That was normal. That was the idea of work. Actually, my mother made lunches in her house for dockers, so their wives were not filling their lunch pails. So there was a problem there, but that's what's supposed to happen. There was no man in the house to provide for a woman worker in this way. Women workers did not have their lunch pails filled. Right? That's the situation. The idea of work, McKinnon explains, was based upon a man's biology. Women have never been in a position to engage in the paid work outside the home that's been based upon the male model. Women's responsibility to service men in the home, to bear and rear children, makes the expectation that women should be able to be equal at work extremely cruel. The fact that women do have children makes the idea of equality at work absurd. I have to say that. I need to sort of set down some boundaries here. So work based upon a man's lifestyle in which he does not have children is a totally different matter. And the whole idea of work would need to be transformed for the possibility of women having even any reasonable possibility to equality within it. Otherwise, women are constantly struggling scrabbling to catch up and wondering why they can't do it, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so the very idea of work is against the interests of women. Women have to take time off, of course, to bear and breastfeed children. They have to find and usually pay for childcare. They must organize the house, etc., etc. All of that, you know. All of that, you know. Apart from the lesbians here who have managed not to be with men at any time, who might not know it quite as well. When all of this is in order, they may then go out to paid work, but ensure that they return in time to organize for the arrival home of the male spouse and avoid his anger if the tasks are not accomplished to his liking, because otherwise she might get hit. There can be no equality here. There is no possibility. Now, sport is another area created around men's interest. McKinnon explains that sport is based upon a male model, it's based upon competition and very generally on aggression, comprising a form of warfare or training in the case of the UK for running the empire. That's where, you know, the Olympics came from and all these men's sports. It's based upon male biology. Women have always had to fit a male model, but they have to wear tiny, tight clothes so that men may have erections whilst looking at them. And that is a big difference. When women seek to engage with and be equal in women's versions of men's sports, they face a quite different playing field. A good example of that of women's boxing. Women's boxing has always had a male audience because it's performed for men's sexual excitement. Women trying to injure each other is an important theme of pornography and the sex industry. So-called mud wrestling, for instance, was done for men's excitement, still is. Forms of women's fighting are sexually exciting to the male viewer and based on misogyny. There can be no equality here. But I should make it clear that I consider that violence should never be seen as sport at all, and there should be no recognition of any forms of violence of this kind as anything to do with sport. My father boxed, and he got Parkinson's disease quite early in the army. In the army, you did box. That was what you did. And I've hated it always. He watched it always. You know how they do. Men watch what's on there. You want to watch on the telly. So you can't be in the common lounge room because it's men belting the daylights out of each other. So you have to run off and try to be somewhere else. That's about men's, you know, ownership of the house for their leisure activities. Fortunately, my mother was always busy in the kitchen. Now, parliamentary democracy. Another hugely important area which women are expected to have ambitions to enter is politics. In politics, women have broken through. And though nowhere near equal, at 35% of parliamentarians in the UK, this is a huge improvement on the situation when the women's liberation movement began around 1970. But they suffer huge disadvantage and are much handicapped in their ability to advance the interests of women. And I'll say a little more about that later. When parliamentary democracy was invented as a system of government, men never thought that women would take part. It was not considered that women could ever vote or be elected. As a result, there were no facilities for women when they did enter men's parliaments. In Australia, the first women were elected to parliament in 1943, but the First Lady's toilet was not established until 1974, 31 years later. So lots of crossed legs for 30 years amongst the women MPs. It was the same in the British Parliament, but I couldn't find the British statistic when I was having a quick look, but it was exactly the same here. It was not just the facilities that were built in men's image. The style in which political work took place was also the idea of two or more opposing political parties, which debated an adversarial style, is created by and suited to men. It is based upon warfare rather than consensus, and demands that women become as abrasive, loud, and assertive as men are brought up and trained to be, in fact, in their private schools and their private school debating societies. And if women can become as abrasive as men, then they will be accused of something else. Plus, of course, male MPs regularly engage in sexist behavior, and women are required to engage in rules of appearance that undermine their dignity and movement, such as partial nudity of legs, shoulders, arms, and chest, crippling shoes, tight clothes, and makeup. They need to look like the underclass, whatever occupation they are in. And that's, of course, the idea of an MP is someone who has a wife to take care of housework and childcaring. This is particularly necessary when the MPs have to live away from home. This is much harder for women to do because they do not have wives who are prepared to provide them with unpaid and selfless labor. The existence of late night or all night settings are extremely unfriendly to women. They're much less common in the last 10 years in the House of Commons, though late night sittings can still take place. They also take place in the House of Lords. They represent the creation of a debating chamber for men who had wives to run their families at a distance. The House of Commons has, since 2012, sought to limit the number of family unfriendly sittings, as they're called. Family, what they mean is unfriendly to women rather than the family. But the House of Lords hasn't done so. Women's ability to be equal in Parliament is fundamentally undermined by men's hatred. Female politicians receive nearly 30 times more online abuse than men. Nearly 9 out of 10 female European Union MPs have said they've been psychologically abused, while 1 of 2 have received rape or death threats. Now, this is not like the situation of men. No. The result is that women may not wish to enter politics or step down early under the pressure of this abuse. The existence of a greater percentage of women in the UK Parliament, though nowhere near equality, has not necessarily led to the interests of women being more prominent. A student of mine in Australia, a young man in fact, some years ago, researched the situation of women MPs. He asked them questions from both main parties about the extent to which they were able to deal with issues of huge importance to women, such as pornography. They told him that it was so hard to be a woman MP, and this was before social media opened up a deluge of death and rape threats for women MPs, that they were unable to promote any policies that would see them as not being entirely inclusive, which actually means putting men first. Now, I'll just say a little bit about finance capitalism, although Catherine McKinnon didn't mention that. It was created, of course, in men's image. It's based upon risk-taking, a feature of socially constructed masculinity, and not of women's behavior. They often say that women are very bad at investing and things because we don't like to do risk-taking. And not surprising, often women have responsibilities, and it's not a good idea to lose millions of pounds. Now, the result is that trading floors are overwhelmingly composed of men, 9 times as many men as women. The usual explanation is that women lack the killer instinct that enables that behavior. That's not, of course, to do with testosterone. There are other explanations. The boys are expected to risk their safety in team sports, for instance, and to tolerate pain and injury as part of manliness. Boys are expected to engage in behavior which may lead to death and injury, such as bungee jumping and white water rafting. All these corporations now have these team building exercises where people die. This is based, of course, on the male risk-taking construction of capitalism as we know it. And of course, survivalism. There's all these survivalism programs on the television, and corporate bungee jumping survivalism is all over the place. Horrifying stuff. Horrifying stuff. I don't know how women deal with it, quite honestly. Now, I don't see men's risk-taking as the result of testosterone, but the way in which boys are trained to be risk-taking. The finance industry depends on the very harmful behavior of men, and there's no way that women can have equality with men in its behavior that men are trained into. We have to get rid of finance capitalism. It's not an easy task, but I suspect we are up to it in this room. Now, I want to talk about pornography and unconscious bias. There's a concept that's increasingly being recognized as important in the workplace called unconscious bias. There can be no equality in any workplace where women have to share space, I would argue, with male fellow workers, whether it's Parliament or an Amazon warehouse, because of the existence and ubiquity of the industry of pornography. Pornography is likely to create what in modern workplace parlance is called unconscious bias, and used to be called prejudice. Do you remember those days? Yeah. Yes. Something called unconscious bias training is the latest fad in the workplace to show that employers are concerned about what is now very generally called diversity, of course, rather than equal opportunities. The Royal Society in the UK provides a useful definition of unconscious bias. They say, unconscious bias is when we make judgments or decisions on the basis of our prior experience, our own personal deep-seated thought patterns, assumptions, or interpretations. And we are not always aware that we are doing it. They don't mention masturbation to pornography, but of course it should be in the list. Now, opposing what used to be called prejudice sounds very positive until we consider what might be constructing the bias of male workers towards women. And that is, I would argue, the use by men of pornography. Where else is all this online abuse and so on coming from? Men can consume women in pornography with an enormous cruel appetite. A YouGov poll from last year shows that 3/4 of British men, 76%, that they've ever watched porn, compared to around half of women, that's 53%. But of course, women generally use porn with pornography because men introduce them to it and wish them to look at it. Now, however, around 1/3 of men, 36%, said they watch pornography at least once a week, including 13% who watch porn every day or most days, like that chap in Parliament who was found to be sitting there using porn on his computer. Well, women say they watch porn at least once a week. So we've got the situation, I would argue, where we've got 1/3 of all employees in pretty much all workplaces not in a decent condition to be okay in a room with women in it. That I would suggest is the situation. It's likely that a great majority of these men work alongside women. It's impossible that these male porn consumers would not have a very conscious bias against their female fellow workers. They were sharing school staff rooms, trading floors, government offices, Amazon warehouses with members of a group of persons, women, whom they've been trained through the reward of sexual excitement to see as bodies for use and vicious abuse. Bodies which enjoy pain even until death. Unconscious bias training cannot really counter this. We have to be polite, don't we? Unconscious bias training is very polite. Porn makes the situation of all women entirely different from that of all men in the public sphere. Outside spaces, and for many women, their homes too, become hostile environments in which males who have been trained to be attack dogs are allowed to roam freely and make women's existence perilous. Pornography, what Kathleen Barry calls the propaganda of woman hatred, is approved and protected by the state. It is a relatively new problem. Back in the 1970s, when I was involved in setting up the first anti-porn group in the UK, porn in the workplace meant pin-ups on the notice board in offices. And we said that was not acceptable, that men had pin-ups on the notice boards. It meant women felt uncomfortable. There was no pornography industry such as exists today. The industry today creates a completely different environment for those who work towards so-called equality in the workplace. In fact, it makes it pretty absurd, I would suggest. Pornography is not understood as hate speech because it's part of the gentleman's agreement between the governments of male domination and their male citizens. It's not unconscious and is necessary for men to get the sexual excitements they see as their right and everyday entertainment, and necessary to boost their manhood. Employers do not take on the task of educating their male workers to abandon porn use, and it's hard to imagine how they could do so. It is only the unconscious bias that they train against, not routine sexual hatred. Now, another factor that prevents women from having equality with men is men's violence. Women inhabit a world of supposedly public equality and determinedly private slavery. This is not the case for men who are racially oppressed or working class. For men, the home provides a place of refuge, even if they're in oppressed groups, where they can recover from the injuries of oppression. For women, it is the most deadly site of their oppression. Rather than offering escape, it is the place where their oppression is concentrated. In the private world of their homes, they may be controlled, beaten, and humiliated daily. This does, of course, not stay in the home, though women may do their best to cover up their black eyes in the boardroom, and there will be women in boardrooms with black eyes. There's been no obvious decrease in violence against women since feminists made this men's violence a political issue instead of just a matter of biology back in the early 1970s. The percentage of rapes reported to the police in the UK that result in a conviction, for instance, is presently 0.6, all-time low. So as feminists say, rape has pretty much been decriminalized in this country. Though women cannot have equality with men in the workplace, whilst men attack them on the way to work and on the way home, in the workplace and in the home, for being women. Many jobs are dangerous for women, for instance, in a way in which they are not for men. Jobs which give men access to them, such as taxi driving, social work that involves visiting homes, nursing, and so on, are particularly dangerous jobs for women to be in, where they cannot be in a situation of equality. Most of the violence, of course, takes place in the home. Unlike men, women are oppressed in their own homes in a way that makes it impossibly hard for them to gain equality in the workplace. When women are working outside the home, they are not only handicapped by their unpaid work in the home, the work of child rearing, etc., etc., etc. A greater handicap, which is seldom mentioned in the context of women's so-called equality, is that of men's violence. The only time you see violence really taken seriously is sometimes they say, well, it takes 2% of the global economy. And, because they want to try and make it worth something, violence against women, not to the women themselves, but if it's the global economy, maybe somebody will notice. Now, I've written in Penal Imperialism how many of the rights that men enjoy, such as the rights of freedom of movement, assembly, expression, and entertainment and culture, are negated by men's violence, sexual harassment, rape, sex murder. But what is called euphemistically domestic violence, i.e. men's violence against women in their own homes, is a huge obstacle to women's ambitions and ability to exercise their talents. When women are being battered, coercively controlled, raped and sexually tortured, economically controlled and robbed, there is no level playing field with the violent men who benefit from the women's labor and resources and often steal their money as well and everything that they earn. They do quite nicely from that. A good example of how men's violence removes any possibility of competing with men on a level playing field is the murder of a woman, Emma Patterson, and her 7-year-old daughter by a violent male partner in the UK in February. The woman was apparently an exceptionally talented educator and had just achieved an ambition of getting appointed as head of a prestigious private school, Epsom College. Her male partner shot the mother and child before shooting himself. He had made a report to police some years before that his wife was being violent to him, and we know what that means. It seems likely to have been a patriarchal reversal. We all know what that means, yes. She likely had to deal with his violence for years while she sought promotions and pursued her career. Imagine what that's like. No possibility of equality there, because she probably couldn't even let him know that she was applying for jobs, because she would be likely hit. There was no level playing field for her. It's cruel to expect women to avail themselves of supposed equal opportunities and to accuse women of being insufficiently ambitious, which is often done. They say about women on boards, women are not ambitious enough when their efforts can result in their deaths. Men do not suffer from such a disadvantage. So, in summing up, what is to be done? The paucity of women in occupations that are well paid and prestigious, and at the heart of governments and the global economy, is simply a manifestation of the subordination of women that exists at the heart of the system. Women cannot be equal in these areas of the public world because the foundation of our oppression lies in the private world of the institution of heterosexuality in marriage and the family. In the possession and control of women's bodies and reproductive capacity that underlies our exclusion or difficulties in admission to the public world. Sorry, it is the possession and control of women's bodies that leads to our exclusion. This is the understanding of radical feminism. We go to the root, radix in Latin, which is the oppression of women in what is seen as the private sphere, though it is extremely political for women. When the onslaught of the men's rights movement, which is centered on transvestism, is defeated, and it is becoming more and more clear that this is happening right now, particularly from the increase in their desperation and aggression, we will be able to concentrate once more on ending women's oppression in a more holistic way. To this end, we need to abandon the language of equality and use a language more suitable to the situation of women. Back in the late 20th century, we used the language of liberation, not that of equality. If women have slavery in the private realm, they need liberation, not equality, because that is an absurd idea. Equality was the language of what was called liberal feminists, those unwilling to recognize the private slavery of women, the fact that women were colonized on the streets and controlled by a reign of terror at home, at work, and outside. We knew that the idea that we should concentrate on campaigning for our equality was a derail. We need liberation from slavery and colonization. We need to identify and remove the bases of men's power. Part of this politics of liberation, rather than accommodation, means analyzing heterosexuality and the ways in which women live with and are controlled by men. We need to promote once again the practice of women leaving men, living with other women, and or becoming lesbians. Now, there are lesbians who oppose the promotion of the liberatory practice of choosing to be lesbians. They say, against all the evidence, that real lesbianism is biological and that the great majority of women are doomed to remain within marriage and relationships with men. So they say it's biological. That means that, women are doomed. Women are doomed. There is nothing we can do. They say that women like me are lesbophobic, i.e. we hate lesbians because we argue for revolutionary change, and indeed say that any woman can be a lesbian. I am enthusiastically working towards this next stage when we can once again speak about women's private slavery, when we can again go to the root and focus on the basis of male power. Thank you.
We've now got Kate Graham.
So this problem with getting the recognition from the Joe public out there that transgenderism was going to cause problems for women, right? Remember that? Like, I think most of us have changed our minds. Like, if you go far enough back, you can hopefully remember a time when you thought, well, bless them, they're just confused or whatever, or maybe they're ill, or, and they just need to get on with it, kind of, and hopefully they can make themselves feel better. And then we sort of realized that, there were problems with it. There's been a resistance to that realization, and that realization is a realization that I think every woman comes to in the course of her own life. And that is the realization that Sheila and other women have referred to today, that men hate us. You know? Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, at first, you know, Catherine McKinnon, like you are, women human. At first, there's a thing about, you know, do they even see us? I remember when I was a teenager, you know, I was about to say something that would incriminate myself there, but when I was going socially out in various different places, meeting different people, and the guys would come into the room and say, oh, hello, to the blokes, and just completely ignore all women in the room. And I used to think, eventually I settled on the understanding that I'm like furniture. You know, I'm just like furniture. I'm there, and you know, it's okay if I'm comfortable and kind of, you know, if I kind of fit in, but I'm not really there to be acknowledged or interacted with or anything like that. So there's that. And then my understanding of how men see us is, maybe it's personal or whatever, but it's developed a bit since then. And I've realized that, you know, in no small part to Valerie Solanas, that, you know, we, not me, but we produce life, right? They're dependent on us for their lives. And they're also, I think, by and large, really vulnerable to desire for us. They experience from a young age, you know, uncontrollable bouts of lust for any random women that they might see or meet or whatever. And for a significant portion of men, it might be a majority. I think this is something that leaves them in a very vulnerable position. Yeah. And I think that is what kind of feeds into their resentment and anger and desire to control women. So there's that. And now, if you're talking with people like men who don't acknowledge that, you know, it's a waste of time, isn't it? And if you're talking with women who don't acknowledge that, it's probably because the consequences of acknowledging that are absolutely huge, right? I mean, Sheila talked there about men watching porn. I mean, I've seen very little porn, and it absolutely destroys me. You know, I can't bear it. You know, so I'm a million miles away from understanding how anybody can get off on it. I can't, it'd be like, you know, when you see little snippets of film about the American white supremacist South lynching black people, black men. And they used to have parties, apparently, sorry to take you there, right? But they used to have parties that invite people to watch these lynchings, and they'd send postcards and shit like this. I mean, it's on a level even worse than that, really, isn't it? I mean, it's horrific. So how are we to take, I mean, what does it actually mean for each and every one of us that a third of the men that we're meeting, that we're seeing, that we're working with, our brothers, our fathers, our uncles, our partners for some of us, are getting off on this abuse, right? And this, I mean, now I don't think it's a good idea to consider stuff like that on your own, because it's scary and debilitating and possibly soul destroying. I don't know. I was really fortunate that I came to terms with stuff like that with other lesbian feminists and consciousness raising groups, you know. And I strongly recommend anybody watching this or anybody here who's not embarked on this exploration to do it with other women in a small group, and to talk about your own experience of growing up, your own experience of violence, your own experience of coercive control, your own experiences, and share them and realize that they're not personal, or at least they're not uniquely personal, and that they are loaded with power, hence the personal being political. And why are they loaded with power? Because men benefit, right? As a whole, they benefit from that. I mean, one of the classic ways that they benefit is, you know, most women will opt to be with one bloke and have a steady boyfriend rather than put up with the vagaries of being vulnerable as a loose woman, as it were, going through school or university and being a target for so many of the other guys that are there. Right. So there's that. Now we know that what do we know? We know that Rosie Duffield, right, who's a British Labour Party MP in Westminster, has received apparently still no messages of support from her front bench following the various threats of violence and rape and murder, some of whom from her own political party, because she stands up for women's rights. Now, I mean, if we're going to be trying to convince guys in political parties that we may or may not be in, if we're going to try and convince them of the value and importance of women's rights, how the hell do we reconcile that with the fact that they don't give a damn about us? And how bad is it? I mean, wait a minute, I have to tell you this. I remember being in this pub, right? One of these ones with the little sort of low-level armrest things, right? And there's these guys, I could hear them within earshot. This woman comes up. She says to these two guys sitting there, "Do you want a drink? I'm going to the bar." Yeah. So she goes off to the bar. So they sit there and they slate her. Absolutely slate her, not just for the way she looks, but they take the piss out of the fact that, oh, we can get drinks off her all night and all that. They were just absolutely vile. And the reason I still remember it is because it still bothers my conscience that I didn't actually go and speak to her and say, look, you know, you should have heard what these guys were saying about you as soon as you were out of earshot. Well, look, sisters, that's what they're saying about us. That is what they're saying about us. Well, it's hard for us to understand because, I mean, we don't get off on seeing men being raped and tortured, right? Not even a third of us in the room get off on that, right? We're not involved in trying to coercively control, I imagine anyway, most of the men in our lives, right? So it can be difficult for us to realise the situation that we're in. But I think we have to do it. If this is about what's to be done, you know, then that is where we have to, I think, start. Every woman that comes to this realisation comes on her own path, come through experience of violence, sexual violence, either to us in our families, in our communities. Others of us come to it, like me, through lesbian feminism. Others of us come to it through custody battles, through issues around pay, access to employment or career opportunities, all sorts of different stuff. We all get into this, what I'm going to describe as a women's liberation movement, right? And so our priorities might be different. So this brings me on to this other thing to say this. I think it's really, really important to respect each other's choices. And I say that mindful of the fact that I was having a go at folks that are trying to use behind the scenes pressures. And I know a lot of good stuff gets done behind the scenes or whatever. I just get frustrated with the fact that not enough evidence of the positive results of that seems. I mean, does it actually change anything? I don't know. Well, let's hope so, eh? So some of us work with organizations like American Sisters Wolf, work with organizations that help to support them to bring legal challenges at the state level and the federal level to their laws and stuff. And like I say, some of us here are in various different political parties or none. And some of us use platforms like the Telegraph or like fairly considered right-wing media platforms to try and put forward our arguments. And others of us avoid them and we're a bit more Puritan about what we will and will not do. But, you know, who was it? Somebody said sisterhood's about supporting women and building women up, not tearing each other down. We really have to try to do that. We really have, in my opinion. And I think that means to some extent that when women backtrack and they you know, even if they can't quite get it together to apologize, if they do make moves to redeem themselves, let's try and reach out. Let's try and meet them halfway-ish. I mean, on a good day. Okay. Okay, here's a really contentious thing I'm saying. I've got an opportunity to say it, so I'm gonna... You're not gonna like it. So, you know, I did engineering, you know, I did maths and engineering, and I'm a geek, you know, and women in science and engineering, they're always on about how they want to recruit women into science and engineering. It's so dreadfully misogynist, you believe it. I mean, that's why our engineering is so dreadful. That's why rooms like this is so incredibly boring, flat and literally mushroom colored. Sorry, mushrooms. Grey. You might think it's funny, but you know, remember we had those buses. Remember we had buses, right? And remember they had bits at the front where you could put your suitcase. Remember that? As you were coming from the airport to wherever the hell you were going. Nowhere you could sit a kid, right? No little seats like you can get in banks and stuff now. And still to this day, nowhere you can hang up a plastic bag of shopping, right? No hangers. So when it's raining and all that, nothing. That's because they're designed by men, right? And everything in this society is set up and designed by men. And we know that they have their hierarchies, they have their linear hierarchies, they have their sports. That's why you have to have winners and losers, right? And it's so they all know their place. And being a teacher, it's really obvious when you teach boys how that settles them all down, right? Once they know their place in the hierarchy, they don't have to fight each other. And if they don't have access to sport, that's when you get gangs and they bite each other, right? With me, our relationships with each other are far more complex and multi-layered and nuanced, as the middle classes like to say. And, you know, I don't think that we have the social and practical facilities to really explore those and to manage the ways that we can be in concert with each other, in tune with each other. You know, I've noticed over these many years that when we have women making banners together, they tend not to fall out, right? When we have women, you know, in choirs and women doing practical, you know, things, it tends to be a lot more peaceable than when we try and have these campaigning groups where we do have a lot of difficulties getting on with each other. So, you know, those systems that would work socially to express our relationships have been willfully destroyed. You know, one of them is our housing. I mean, we've got this nuclear family housing, ridiculous situation, you know, where we can't live together in loose sororities, you know, of women of different ages and kids and all the rest of it. So, I mean, it is difficult. Okay, and one of the major things that I think influences all of that is this thing, status, you know, status. I think it kind of is the generator of political power. That you know, we talk about being radical feminists and going to the roots, and I think we have to begin to explore more seriously how status affects our relationships with each other, what status is. And we can think about it fairly obviously in relation to how we post pictures of our new babies and our grandchildren, and we tell each other, you know, all sorts of notions like, you know, I'm getting married or whatever it is. There are all sorts of things that I feel as a lesbian who's not had kids and is estranged from her family, you know, quite unhooked by, unhinged by, and kind of, you know, left out. And it's important. It's an important part of social fabric that I don't think we've explored sufficiently. And the other thing that I don't think we've acknowledged or explored is this notion of male sexual violence, right? I live on a canal boat down here in London now. I'm rounding up, this is it. Okay, I've seen the drakes rape a duck on the canal. I've seen it happen more than once. I've seen it with different birds. I know it happens with whales and dolphins, and there are other mammals with. Now, a lot of you have gone and done sociology degrees now, way back in the past, and you've kind of seemed to have accepted, probably with very good reason, that male hatred of women is socially constructed. And it's definitely, I agree, supported by patriarchal structures, obviously. Right? You with me? But I think there's more to it than that. And I think we have to be brave. And I think we have to face that. And I think we have to look at women's liberation as a project to manage male sexual hatred and violence towards women. Right? Rather than thinking that if we get rid of some of these structures, somehow that's going to be enough and men are going to just suddenly accept us and not feel threatened or vulnerable or all the things that give rise to them hating us and wanting to control us. So that is, I think, quite a challenging thing to suggest. I think a lot of us lesbian feminists actually secretly think it anyway. But I don't know whether that is particularly acknowledged in the way that it needs to be. Okay, what's to be done? One more thing, deeds, not words. You know, one of the things that changed the situation in Scotland was Elaine and our American. You know, she gave the red top newspapers a really good photo opportunity that they just could not afford to give up. And that went out and that was like, haha, isn't this funny, blah, blah, blah. And then the very next week, 3 days later, we had Isla, what's his name? His surname's Graham, actually. Let's see it. No, man, he's a multiple rapist. He's a violent thug. He's a really evil piece of work, right? And my heart, my sympathy goes out to all the women that I've had to be in the same room as, and never mind that being a shower room, you know. And that was what peak trans half the bloody country, you know. And that is the kind of thing that we need. You know, we need the truth, and we need confrontation and stuff like that. And I was arguing with some of the people outside the Scottish Labour Party conference just a few days after that all kicked off in January there. And this guy comes out, he says he's a trade unionist, right? I said, you want to have your photo taken next to the banner with some good banners and that? I was talking to this bloke, there I was, being nice, right? Kind. He said, oh, I have to be careful. I have to be careful. And I just lost it. I lost the heat at him. I started shouting him in the street. And I shouted this biological determinist thing at him, which is grow up here. You have to be careful. You have to be careful, you know. And the wee lashes that I've got to put up with, blokes and blah, 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 shouting out in the street. And I think we need a bit more of that. I think we need a bit more of that, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.